At 3:50 in the afternoon on March 7, 1945, a thunderous explosion ripped through the air above the Rhine River. A column of smoke and debris shot skyward as timbers flew in every direction. German soldiers watching from the eastern bank held their breath, certain they had just witnessed the destruction of the last bridge standing across Germany's greatest natural barrier. When the dust cleared, every man on both sides of the river stared in disbelief. The massive steel structure was still there, damaged, swaying, but standing. The Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen had just refused to die. The Germans had tried to destroy it. They had packed it with explosives. They had blown the charges. And somehow, impossibly, the bridge survived. What happened next would change the course of World War II. Within minutes, American soldiers would sprint across that wounded span, becoming the first invading army to cross the Rhine since Napoleon, over 130 years earlier. Within hours, thousands would follow. Within days, the Third Reich's last great defensive barrier would be shattered beyond repair. And Adolf Hitler, consumed by fury, would order the execution of 4 German officers for a failure that was never truly theirs. This is the story of a bridge that was never supposed to matter, a handful of soldiers caught in an impossible moment, and the 10 days that cracked open the final defense of Nazi Germany. The Ludendorff Bridge was born from the mind of General Erich Ludendorff during the First World War. In 1916, seeking to speed the flow of troops and supplies to the Western Front, the German General Staff authorized 3 railroad bridges across the Rhine. One would be built at Remagen, a small winemaking town of about 5,000 residents nestled between steep hills on the river's western bank. The town was known for its vineyards and its Apollinaris mineral springs, not for strategic importance. The architect Karl Wiener of Mannheim designed the crossing, and construction began using Russian prisoners of war as forced labor, men who worked in brutal conditions to build a bridge they would never cross as free men. The bridge cost approximately 2.1 million marks and was completed in 1918, though the full railway system through the tunnel would not become operational until the following year. But what the builders created was an engineering marvel of its era. The total length measured 398 meters, including the earthen approach ramps on both banks. The steel structure itself spanned 325 meters across the Rhine, which ran swift and deep at this point, 270 to 300 meters wide, and completely unfordable. 3 massive spans, a central arch of 156 meters, flanked by 2 trusses of 85 meters each, rested on 4 stone piers driven deep into the riverbed. The arch rose over 28 meters above the water. The bridge carried 2 sets of railroad tracks with pedestrian catwalks on either side, wide enough for 2 trains to pass abreast. Wooden planking could be laid over one track set to permit vehicles to cross. The entire structure weighed 4,640 tons of steel, concrete, and stone. It was built to last a century. 4 castle-like towers guarded the approaches, 2 on each bank, with machine gun embrasures built into their thick stone walls. These towers could shelter a full battalion of troops and provide defensive fire across the entire bridge span. On the eastern bank, a railroad tunnel bored through the Erpelallee, a sheer basalt cliff rising over 150 meters above the river. This 383-meter tunnel, curving so that one end could not see the other, would become the stage for one of the war's most dramatic command failures. The cliff itself was so steep that climbing it was nearly impossible. Field Marshal Walter Model himself had declared that only a fool would try to cross the Rhine where cliffs rose so steeply on the opposite bank. The bridge's designers, anticipating future conflicts, had built cavities into the concrete piers specifically for demolition charges. Electrical circuits protected by steel tubing ran to a control panel inside the tunnel, ready to destroy the bridge at a moment's notice. It was standard German military engineering. Every important bridge had such provisions. After the First World War, French occupation forces filled these demolition cavities with concrete, hoping to permanently disable the system. But when Germany remilitarized the Rhineland in 1938, engineers attached 60 zinc-lined boxes to key structural points, each designed to hold 3.66 kilograms of explosives, and reinstalled the electrical detonation system with a backup primer cord. The bridge was once again ready to be destroyed on command. The location itself seemed strategically worthless to military planners on both sides. Beyond the river's width and the forbidding cliff on the eastern bank lay the rough, heavily wooded Westerwald, with limited roads leading inland. The terrain was simply not suitable for armoured operations. No major city lay within easy striking distance. No important industrial facilities beckoned. Both the Germans and the Americans dismissed Remagen as a crossing point. This mutual dismissal would prove decisive. The Germans underdefended it, and the Americans were not even supposed to be there. By March 1st, 1945, the war in Europe was entering its final desperate phase. The Western Front had become a scene of German collapse, unlike anything seen since the Allied breakout from Normandy. Operation Lumberjack was clearing the Rhine's western bank of enemy forces. The American First and Third Armies were grinding forward relentlessly. Some 280,000 German soldiers had been captured west of the river in the preceding weeks. Another 120,000 had been killed, wounded, or reported missing. The Wehrmacht was bleeding out, its divisions reduced to shadows of their former strength, its supply lines strangled by Allied air power, its air force nearly grounded by fuel shortages and pilot losses. The planned Allied Rhine crossing was to be Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's Operation Plunder, a massive set-piece assault rivaling the Normandy invasion in scale and complexity. It was scheduled for late March, far to the north near Wesel. Tens of thousands of troops, hundreds of landing craft, elaborate smoke screens, massive artillery barrages, airborne drops. Everything had been planned down to the last detail over months of preparation. No one expected the Rhine to be crossed at Remagen. General Dwight Eisenhower, however, had issued a standing order to all his commanders. If any unit found an intact bridge, they were to exploit its use to the fullest and establish a bridgehead on the eastern bank. In the chaos of war, such opportunities were rare and precious. Of the Rhine's original 47 road and railroad bridges, only 4 remained standing by early March. One by one, the Germans had destroyed them as American forces approached, preferring to eliminate their own infrastructure rather than let it fall into enemy hands. The Great Hohenzollern Bridge at Cologne, that magnificent structure with its sweeping arches and famous cathedral backdrop, fell on March 6 when German engineers detonated the charges as American troops reached the western bank. The Bonn Bridge was blown on March 8th. The Irmitz Bridge was destroyed on March 9th. The Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen was the only one the Germans failed to destroy. The 9th Armoured Division, nicknamed the Phantom Division for its ability to appear unexpectedly across the battlefield, was the spearhead of 3rd Corps under Major General John Milliken. The division had earned its reputation in the Ardennes during the Battle of the Bulge, where it had fought with distinction despite heavy losses. On the morning of March 7th, its Combat Command B, led by Brigadier General William Hogue, organized into 2 columns advancing toward the Rhine. The northern column, Task Force Engermann under Lieutenant Colonel Leonard Engermann, received orders to take the town of Remagen and, if by some miracle the bridge still stood, to grab it. Task Force Engermann was a mixed force designed for speed and flexibility in the fluid conditions of pursuit warfare. It included C Troop of the 89th Reconnaissance Squadron with their M8 armoured cars and half-tracks, fast vehicles designed to probe enemy positions and report back. Company A of the 27th Armoured Infantry Battalion was attached, now under the command of a brand new leader, Second Lieutenant Karl Timmermann, who had taken over just the day before when the previous commanding officer was wounded by shrapnel. A platoon of the 9th Armoured Engineer Battalion under Lieutenant Hugh Mott provided demolition expertise, men trained to both destroy and preserve bridges depending on the tactical situation. And companies of the 14th Tank Battalion brought heavy firepower, including 2nd Lieutenant John Grimball's platoon of 4 operational T-26E3 Pershing heavy tanks, the United States Army's newest and most powerful armored vehicle, mounting a 90mm gun that could destroy any German tank at normal combat ranges. On the German side, the situation was chaos made lethal by incompetence and bad luck. The command structure had been shattered by a series of disasters. The 53rd Corps commander responsible for the Remagen sector, General Edwin Graf von Rothkirch, had wandered into American lines and been captured on March 6. He was now a prisoner of war, being interrogated by American intelligence officers, completely unaware that his absence had thrown the entire command structure into confusion. At 1 in the morning on March 7th, General Otto Hitzfeld of the 67th Corps, whose headquarters was 64 kilometers from the bridge, learned he was now responsible for defending it. Hitzfeld was a capable officer, but he was being handed an impossible task with no time and no resources. He dispatched his adjutant, Major Hans Scheller, a 32-year-old officer with a wife and 2 children and a third on the way, with 8 men and a radio to take command at Remagen. Scheller's orders were impossibly contradictory, the kind of orders that get men killed and careers destroyed in the chaos of defeat. Defend the bridge, prepare it for demolition, destroy it if necessary. But also allow retreating German forces to continue crossing so they could be saved to fight another day. How one man was supposed to accomplish all of this simultaneously, no one bothered to explain. Scheller's journey to the bridge became a microcosm of the Reich's disintegration. His vehicle became separated from the radio truck on roads, choked with fleeing troops, abandoned equipment, dead horses, burning vehicles, and terrified civilians trying to escape the approaching Americans. He ran out of fuel. The radio truck turned back, its driver deciding the mission was hopeless, leaving Scheller without communications. He would not reach Remagen until 11:15 in the morning, nearly 10 hours after departing and barely 2 hours before the Americans arrived. He arrived to find a situation far worse than anyone had told him. What Scheller found at the bridge was a garrison in name only. Captain Willy Bracci, a combat veteran who wore 2 Iron Crosses earned in hard fighting on the Eastern Front, commanded just 36 convalescent soldiers, some of them physically unable to fire a weapon, men recovering from wounds and illness who had been assigned to what everyone assumed was a quiet rear area post. Captain Karl Friesenhahn, a 50-year-old veteran of the First World War who had served in the trenches at Verdun, led roughly 120 older engineer reservists, responsible for the bridge's maintenance and potential demolition. These were not young soldiers, but middle-aged men with families, men who remembered the last war and had no desire to die in this one. The Luftwaffe anti-aircraft crews positioned on the Erpeler Lay answered to their own chain of command and took orders from no one at the bridge. They were there to shoot at aircraft, not to fight infantry. Approximately 180 Hitler youth, boys as young as 15, who had been fed propaganda instead of military training, were theoretically available. 500 Volkssturm militia, old men and boys with armbands instead of uniforms and hunting rifles instead of military weapons, made up the bulk of the supposed defenders. 120 Eastern volunteers of questionable loyalty, men who had been pressed into German service from occupied territories and had every reason to surrender at the first opportunity, added uncertain numbers. 200 anti-aircraft troops brought the nominal garrison to about 1,000, but there was no unified command, no reliable communications, no prepared defensive positions, and no serious defensive capability. These were not elite troops ready to die for the fatherland. They were the dregs of a collapsing empire, men and boys who had been left behind because they were not worth sending to the front. March 7th, 1945, began like any ordinary day at the Ludendorff Bridge. The morning was cool but clear, with good visibility across the river and across the steep hills that surrounded the town. German troops, military vehicles, civilian refugees pushing handcarts piled with belongings, and even livestock streamed across the span in a continuous flow of retreat. Locomotives puffed on the eastern bank, ready to haul whatever could be saved deeper into Germany before the Americans arrived. Engineers checked the demolition charges, now finally in place after months of Hitler's paranoid restrictions. Anti-aircraft gunners on the cliff scanned empty skies, seeing nothing but scattered clouds. No one could have imagined that in just a few hours, this unremarkable bridge in an unremarkable town would become the most important piece of real estate in Europe. At 12:56 in the afternoon, scouts from the 89th Reconnaissance Squadron crested a hill overlooking Remagen. The town spread out below them, picturesque with its church steeples and wine cellars, and the great stone towers of the bridge visible at the water's edge. What they saw left them astonished. The bridge was still standing. Through their binoculars, they watched German troops and vehicles streaming across in desperate retreat, a column of defeat flowing over the water. There was no sign that demolition was imminent. No smoke, no flames, no frantic activity at the towers. The scouts radioed back their incredible discovery, their voices crackling with excitement. Lieutenant Timmermann and Lieutenant Grimball rushed forward to confirm the sighting with their own eyes. The word raced up the chain of command to Engermann, who arrived at the overlook at approximately 1 in the afternoon. He stared at the bridge through his binoculars for a long moment, scarcely able to believe what he was seeing. At 1:50, Timmermann's dismounted infantry moved into Remagen on foot, working their way through streets that offered minimal resistance. The sounds of small arms fire echoed between the buildings, but it was scattered and uncoordinated. Most of the Volkssturm militia had already melted away, their enthusiasm for dying vanishing as American tanks appeared on the hills above. Old men dropped their rifles and raised their hands. Boys in Hitler Youth uniforms ran for cellars. At 2:20, Grimball's Pershing tanks followed, quickly overtaking the infantry and racing through the town toward the bridge approaches, their engines roaring between the narrow stone buildings. Then came an electrifying piece of intelligence. A captured German prisoner claimed the bridge was scheduled to be destroyed at 4 in the afternoon. The clock was now ticking. They had less than 2 hours. At approximately 3 in the afternoon, Captain Friesenhahn detonated the charge under the western approach ramp. The explosion was massive, blasting a 30-foot crater in the earth and sending debris flying in all directions. Windows shattered in nearby buildings. The Pershing tanks ground to a halt, unable to cross the gap. American soldiers dove for cover, but the blast had an unintended consequence. The crater provided cover for the infantry positioned behind the tanks, and the destruction of the approach ramp may have damaged the electrical circuit connecting the main detonation system to the control panel inside the tunnel. General Hogue, who had heard the 4 o'clock demolition rumor, made the decision that would echo through history. He ordered Engermann to take that bridge as soon as possible. The command chain snapped taut. Hogue to Engermann to Major Murray Devers to Timmermann. Devers looked at the young lieutenant, this 22-year-old who had been in command for exactly 1 day, and asked if he thought he could get his company across. Timmermann's response was understated and unforgettable. He said they could try it. When Timmermann asked what would happen if the bridge blew up in his face, Devers had no answer. There was nothing to say. They all knew the risks. Men would probably die. The bridge might collapse and take everyone on it into the cold, swift river. But the opportunity was too great to let pass. What followed in the next 30 minutes was a cascade of failures that would cost 4 German officers their lives. The demolition system that was supposed to guarantee the bridge's destruction had been fatally compromised by a series of decisions stretching back months, decisions made by men far from the bridge who never imagined the consequences. The first critical failure occurred on October 14, 1944, when an American bomb struck the Mulheim Bridge in Cologne and accidentally detonated its pre-positioned demolition charges. The bridge was destroyed while the Germans still needed it, causing serious supply problems. Hitler's furious response was an order requiring all bridge demolition charges to be removed until the enemy was within 8 kilometers. Destruction was permitted only on written order from the tactical commander. The Führer did not trust his own officers. By March 7, 1945, the 60 charges in the zinc-lined boxes had been removed from the Ludendorff Bridge and stored nearby, ready to be reinstalled when the Americans got close enough. The bridge's built-in demolition system was essentially disarmed by Hitler's own paranoid decree. The explosive supply failure compounded the problem catastrophically. Friesenhahn had requested 600 kilograms of military-grade explosives, the calculated minimum needed to sever the massive steel spans of the bridge. He had done the calculations himself. 600 kilograms, properly placed, would drop the bridge into the Rhine in seconds. At approximately 11 in the morning on March 7th, he received exactly half that amount, 300 kilograms of donerit. This was an industrial mining explosive, composed of roughly 70% ammonium nitrate, 25% TNT, and 5% nitroglycerin. Donerit was significantly weaker than standard military demolition charges. It was designed to break rock in quarries, not cut through hardened structural steel. Friesenhahn knew it was not enough. He placed all of it on the bridge's southeastern pier as a backup measure, hoping desperately it would be sufficient if the main electrical charges failed. The first demolition attempt, the western approach charge at approximately 3:15, was the only one that worked as intended. It created that massive crater that stopped the tanks, but could not prevent infantry from crossing on foot. The blast may also have damaged the electrical circuit connecting the main detonation system to the control panel in the tunnel. The second attempt was the main electrical detonation, the one that should have guaranteed the bridge's destruction. Inside the Erpelerlei tunnel, with American infantry already visible on the bridge approach moving forward in short rushes from cover to cover, bureaucratic procedure nearly consumed the last precious minutes. Friesenhahn, who had been knocked unconscious by a shell concussion for approximately 15 minutes, and was still dazed with blood running down his face, demanded a written order from Major Scheller before proceeding. This was required by Wehrmacht regulations. Without written authorization, destroying the bridge could be considered sabotage. Captain Bracci sprinted through the 370-meter curved tunnel to find Scheller. His footsteps echoing off the stone walls, obtained the written order, and ran back. The precious minutes were bleeding away as American soldiers crept closer. At approximately 3:20, Friesenhahn made the final connections and twisted the detonator handle. Nothing happened. He tried again, checking the connections, twisting harder. Nothing. A third time, still nothing. The electrical circuit was broken. American engineers who later examined the bridge found that a steel pipe containing wires to the main charge had been cut, severed by American shellfire or concussion from the initial approach blast. They also found an additional 230-kilogram TNT charge whose blasting cap had simply failed to detonate, its mechanism corroded or defective. The electrical system was dead. The third and final attempt was manual ignition, the last desperate hope. Friesenhahn called for a volunteer, knowing he was asking a man to run into certain death. Corporal Anton Faust stepped forward without hesitation. With American machine guns and tank fire raking the bridge, tracers streaking through the air, Faust sprinted approximately 90 yards across the exposed span to the eastern pier. Bullets sparked off the steel girders around him. He reached the backup primer cord connected to the Donnerit charges and successfully ignited it, the fuse hissing and sparking. Then he ran for his life, diving for cover in one of the stone towers. The wait was agonizing. Everyone on both sides of the river watched the bridge, hearts pounding, breath held. Then came a thunderous roar that shook the ground. The bridge seemed to leap from its foundations. Timbers flew in every direction. Smoke and dust enveloped the entire span like a grey curtain. For a terrible, hopeful moment, the Germans believed they had succeeded. American soldiers ducked for cover, pressing themselves against the earth, certain the structure was about to collapse into the Rhine. When the dust cleared, the bridge was still standing. The weak Donnerit had damaged a 30-foot section of the upstream truss. It destroyed part of the eastern catwalk, sending planks spinning into the river. It blew holes in the deck planking. But the massive steel structure, overbuilt by its First World War designers to carry heavy railroad traffic for decades, held firm. The arches remained intact. The piers were unshaken. 300 kilograms of substandard industrial explosive against 4,640 tons of steel and stone was never going to be enough. The bridge had refused to die. The men who crossed the Ludendorff Bridge that afternoon did so expecting it to disintegrate beneath their feet at any moment. Their story is one of raw, unreasoning courage in the face of almost certain death. Every man who stepped onto that damaged, swaying span knew it might collapse. Every man went anyway. Second Lieutenant Karl Timmermann was perhaps the most improbable hero of the European War. He was born on June 19, 1922, in Frankfurt am Main, Germany, barely 160 kilometers from Remagen. His father was an American soldier from the occupation forces after the First World War, who had deserted from his unit, married a German woman named Mary Weisbecker, and smuggled his family to the United States in 1924 when Karl was 2 years old. They settled in West Point, Nebraska, a small farming community on the plains far from the battlefields of Europe. Karl grew up speaking both English and German, an American boy with German blood. He enlisted in July 1940 and earned his commission at Fort Benning. He deployed to France in September 1944 and was wounded during the Battle of the Bulge, shrapnel tearing into his leg. March 7 was his first day commanding Company A after the previous commander went down. It would make him the first officer of an invading army to cross the Rhine since Napoleon. At approximately 3:35, after the German demolition charge had failed to destroy the bridge, Timmermann ordered his men forward. He did not ask for volunteers. He did not give a rousing speech. He simply said to follow him and started walking toward the bridge. Staff Sergeant Joseph Delicio's 3rd Platoon led the way, rushing from girder to girder across a bridge that was damaged, swaying with every footstep, still smoking from the explosion, and under continuous German fire from the towers and the far bank. The men had to step over holes, blasted in the deck planking, gaps through which they could see the cold grey water swirling 40 meters below. They dodged debris and jagged steel edges that could slice through uniforms and flesh. They ignored the terrifying groans of stressed steel beneath their boots, sounds that made every man certain the next step would be his last. Directly behind the lead infantry came 3 combat engineers, First Lieutenant Hugh Mott, Staff Sergeant John Reynolds, and Sergeant Eugene Dorland were performing one of the most dangerous tasks imaginable. They were locating and cutting demolition wires on a bridge that had already partially detonated and might finish exploding at any second. One remaining charge, one uncut wire, and they would all be dead. Mott found that the main demolition cable was too thick for his wire cutters. Without hesitation, he drew his carbine and fired 3 shots to sever it, sparks flying from the steel. The engineers found and neutralized approximately 160 kilograms of unexploded charges, pulling wires and throwing the deadly packages over the railing into the Rhine far below. Each charge they found was a reminder of how close they had come to dying. Sergeant Alexander Drabik, a 34-year-old former butcher from Holland, Ohio, became the first American soldier to reach the east bank of the Rhine. He was the youngest son of 14 children born to Polish immigrants, a man who understood hard work and physical courage and had no patience for hesitation. His account of the crossing was characteristically understated. He said they ran down the middle of the bridge, shouting as they went to keep their courage up. He did not stop, because he knew that if he kept moving, the Germans could not hit him. His men were in squad column, and not one of them was hit despite the bullets flying around them. They took cover in bomb craters on the far side and waited for the others to come. That was how it was. Upon reaching the eastern bank, a German soldier pointed a rifle at Drabik's chest at point-blank range. For one frozen moment, the 2 men stared at each other, the German's finger on the trigger, Drabik's hands still gripping his own weapon. Then the German lowered his rifle and surrendered without firing. The will to fight had drained from the defenders. They had done their duty. The bridge had not fallen. Now they were finished. Delisio charged into one of the eastern stone towers, kicking open the door with his rifle ready. Inside he found German soldiers desperately trying to clear a jammed machine gun, working frantically at the mechanism. They looked up and saw the American, and their hands went up immediately. Staff Sergeant Michael Chinchar, a Russian-speaking soldier who had earlier interrogated Eastern laborers about the demolition timetable, led his first platoon down the left catwalk and cleared the second tower. More prisoners emerged with hands raised. Timmermann was the 10th man across the bridge and the first officer. He crossed into the land of his birth wearing an American uniform, returning to Germany not as a refugee but as a conqueror. By 3:50 in the afternoon, all of Company A was across the Rhine. Remarkably, despite continuous fire throughout the crossing, not a single soldier was killed on the bridge itself. Several were wounded, but every man made it to the eastern bank alive. Delisio then led 4 men into the tunnel entrance, the darkness swallowing them as they moved forward cautiously. They destroyed the ignition switchbox and took German prisoners who emerged from the shadows with their hands up. Delisio did not realize that several hundred German soldiers and civilians were hiding deeper in the 383-meter darkness, terrified and uncertain what to do, huddled together in the cold and the dark, waiting to see what would happen. Lieutenant Emmett Burrows took the 2nd platoon up the sheer face of the Erpel Alley to secure the cliff top and prevent the Germans from organizing a counterattack from above. The climb was so treacherous that soldiers fell and were seriously injured, tumbling down the rocky slope to land in heaps at the bottom. Burrows later recalled that taking Remagen and crossing the bridge was easy compared to climbing that cliff. His men clawed their way up with their fingers and the butts of their rifles, pulling themselves over loose rock and through tangled brush, completely exposed to fire from above. At 5:30 in the afternoon, with Americans controlling both tunnel exits and the heights above and more troops pouring across every minute, Captain Bracci recognized the situation was hopeless. He had done everything he could. The bridge had not fallen despite 3 demolition attempts. Now he was surrounded by Americans, with more arriving constantly. He ordered surrender. German soldiers and civilians began emerging from the tunnel darkness with their hands raised, blinking in the fading light. Major Scheller had already escaped on a bicycle, the only transport available, riding off into the twilight to find a radio and report the disaster to his superiors. He reached 67th Corps headquarters around midnight. He had 7 days to live. The news of the bridge's capture reached the top of the Allied command structure like an electric shock. General Omar Bradley, upon hearing from Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges that they had grabbed a bridge at Remagen, slammed his hand on the table in excitement and exclaimed that this would bust the Germans wide open. It was the kind of opportunity commanders dream of, the gift that war rarely gives. When Eisenhower's operations officer protested that the crossing did not fit into the carefully laid plans for Operation Plunder to the north, Bradley shot back that a bridge was a bridge and mighty good anywhere across the Rhine. Plans could be changed. Opportunities like this came once in a war. Eisenhower agreed immediately and ordered Bradley to hold the bridgehead with everything available. His chief of staff, Lieutenant General Walter Bedell Smith, declared the bridge worth its weight in gold. On the German side, the reaction was catastrophic and immediate. Hitler flew into one of his legendary rages in the bunker beneath Berlin, screaming at his generals, pounding the table, demanding to know how this had happened. He took brutal action. He dismissed Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt as Commander-in-Chief West on March 10, replacing him with Field Marshal Albert Kesselring from the Italian front. This was the third time von Rundstedt had been relieved from command during the war. Kesselring, a capable officer who had conducted a masterful fighting retreat up the Italian peninsula, arrived at his new headquarters and dryly introduced himself as the new V3, a bitter reference to the wonder weapons that were supposed to save Germany but never would. He called Remagen the crime of Remagen and declared that the military situation had become nearly catastrophic. The front along the Rhine was broken, and there was nothing he could do to repair it. Hitler's most vindictive response was the creation of the Flying Special Court Marshal West. He personally summoned Lieutenant General Rudolf Hübner, described by those who knew him as a fanatical and reliable Nazi who would do whatever the Führer demanded, from the Eastern Front to preside over the trials. Hübner arrived at Army Group B headquarters, accompanied by 2 staff officers and 2 military policemen who served as the execution squad. They brought their own rifles. None of the 3 judges had legal experience. The trials were held in a restaurant near Bernbach in the Westerwald, approximately 60 miles from the bridge. The defendants had no proper defense counsel. The outcomes were predetermined before the proceedings began. This was not justice. This was revenge. 4 officers were executed on March 14, 1945, exactly 1 week after the bridge's capture. Major Hans Scheller, convicted of cowardice and dereliction of duty, was shot in the back of the neck at Rimbach in the traditional German military execution style. He was 31 years old. His wife was pregnant with their 3rd child, a baby he would never see. Field Marshal Model himself stated after the war that Scheller was completely innocent, a man who had been given impossible orders and insufficient resources, and then punished for failing to accomplish the impossible. Decades later, his son Gert succeeded in clearing his father's name through the German courts, restoring the family honor that had been stripped away. Lieutenant Karl-Heinz Peters, the Luftwaffe rocket battery commander who had pleaded with Scheller for time to get his secret weapons across before demolition, was convicted of allowing classified equipment to fall into enemy hands. He was also shot at Rimbach. His conviction was particularly unjust. He was a passerby at the bridge, not part of the bridge defense at all. He had simply been trying to save his equipment and had gotten caught in the disaster. Majors Herbert Strobel and August Kraft, engineer officers who had organized a scratch counterattack force after the bridge fell, attempting to recapture it with about 100 men scraped together from retreating units, were convicted of dereliction of duty and executed at Oberösen. Their counterattack had been scattered by American pickets in confused night fighting, their men melting away into the darkness. They had tried to retake the bridge and failed. For this, they died with bullets in the backs of their necks. Captain Willy Brache was convicted and sentenced to death in absentia. He survived only because he was an American prisoner of war, safely beyond Hitler's reach. Captain Karl Friesenhahn was the only defendant acquitted, the court acknowledging he had done everything possible under impossible circumstances. He had requested the proper explosives and been denied. He had prepared the demolition system correctly. He had tried 3 times to destroy the bridge. He had simply failed because he was given inadequate tools. On March 18, Kesselring and Model sent a special dispatch to every unit in the German military, describing the executions as a warning to anyone who might fail in their duty to the Reich. The message was clear. Failure meant death, regardless of circumstances. The Reich was dying, and it would take its servants with it. The German counterattack against the Remagen bridgehead deployed virtually every weapon system remaining in the Wehrmacht's arsenal. It became the largest concentration of firepower against a single tactical target in the entire European war. Hitler demanded the bridge be destroyed at any cost, and his commanders threw everything they had left at it. The Luftwaffe flew 367 sorties against the bridge over 10 days, including missions by the Arado 234, the world's first operational turbojet bomber, a revolutionary aircraft that could outrun any Allied fighter. On March 10 alone, the Germans attacked for 6.5 continuous hours, wave after wave of aircraft diving through curtains of anti-aircraft fire to release their bombs. American anti-aircraft gunners claimed 28 of 47 aircraft shot down that day, the sky filled with burning planes and parachutes and smoking debris. The Americans responded by positioning the largest concentration of anti-aircraft weapons assembled during the entire war, 5 full anti-aircraft battalions ringing the bridgehead with hundreds of guns. Nearly 30% of all German aircraft dispatched were destroyed. The Luftwaffe bled out its last reserves over Remagen. Artillery proved the most effective German weapon. Over 100 pieces, including 105mm, 150mm, and 210mm howitzers, pounded the bridge and bridgehead continuously day and night. The shells screamed in from the hills, exploding on the bridge deck and in the water, and among the troops crowding the approaches. On March 8 and 9, the bridge took 24 direct hits. A hit on an ammunition truck blew a 15-foot hole in the deck. On March 10, a direct hit killed the executive officer of the 276th Engineer Combat Battalion and injured 19 others. The engineers worked on, repairing damage even as more shells fell around them. The Germans even deployed the Karl Gerät, a 600mm super-heavy mortar weighing 130 tons that fired shells up to 2,170 kilograms, shells so massive they could destroy an entire building with a single hit. It was one of the largest artillery pieces ever built, a monster of a weapon that had to be transported on special railroad cars. Its 14 rounds all missed the bridge. The weapon was simply too inaccurate at that range, and the Americans kept moving, never presenting a stationary target. On March 17, Hitler ordered SS General Hans Kammler to fire V-2 rockets at the bridge. This was the first and only time V-2 rockets were used against a tactical military target, and the only time they were deliberately fired at a German target on German soil. Battery SS 500 at Hellendoorn, in the Netherlands, 200 kilometers north, launched 11 V-2 rockets between 9:45 in the morning and 9:45 in the evening. The notoriously inaccurate missiles, designed to terrorize cities rather than hit precise targets, landed as far away as Cologne, 64 kilometers to the north. One hit a hospital, another destroyed homes in a residential neighborhood. The closest strike hit 270 meters from the bridge, destroying the 284th Engineer Combat Battalion's command post, killing 3 soldiers and wounding 30. Another struck the village of Eudingen, killing 3 American soldiers and a number of German civilians who had been sheltering in their cellars. Witnesses described the impacts as feeling like earthquakes. Hitler also summoned SS Lieutenant Colonel Otto Skorzeny, the famous commando who had rescued Mussolini from captivity in that daring glider raid, to organize naval frogmen to destroy the bridge underwater. 7 SS swimmers equipped with Italian breathing apparatus were dispatched down the Rhine, their mission to attach explosives to the bridge piers underwater where no one could stop them. By the time they reached the area, the Ludendorff Bridge had already collapsed. Redirected against the pontoon bridges, they were detected by a weapon making its first combat appearance. Canal defense lights were powerful searchlights with parabolic reflectors that illuminated the river surface like daylight and exposed the swimmers thrashing in the current. All the frogmen were killed or captured. The Germans also floated mines and explosive-laden barges downriver. All were intercepted by log and net booms constructed by American engineers who had anticipated exactly this kind of attack. Meanwhile, American engineers worked around the clock under continuous fire. The 291st Engineer Combat Battalion began constructing a pontoon bridge 400 meters downstream on March 9th. They completed the 1,032-foot span in just 32 hours, working through artillery barrages and air attacks. It was the first Allied tactical bridge across the Rhine. More bridges followed, a Treadway Bridge and a Bailey Bridge, each one adding to the flow of troops and equipment across the river. Bradley authorized expanding the bridgehead by 1,000 meters per day to prevent the Germans from establishing a stable defensive line. German counterattacks with elements of the 9th Panzer, 11th Panzer, and Panzer Lehr divisions were hobbled by catastrophic weakness. The three divisions together mustered only about 60 tanks and 12,000 men, shadows of the powerful formations that had conquered France in 1940. The 11th Panzer was so short of fuel it could not move for 3 days, its tanks sitting useless while crews scrounged for gasoline. Over 11,000 German troops were captured during the bridgehead battles. The Ludendorff Bridge had been closed to traffic on March 12 for urgently needed structural repairs. The cumulative damage from the failed demolition, the artillery hits, the near misses from V-2 rockets, and the constant heavy traffic had taken a severe toll on the wounded structure. Engineers from the 276th Engineer Combat Battalion and the 1058th Engineer Port Construction and Repair Group were working on the damaged span, trying to strengthen it enough to bear continued use. At 3 in the afternoon on March 17, almost exactly 10 days to the hour after its capture, Lieutenant Colonel Clayton Rust of the 276th was standing at the center of the bridge, supervising repairs, when he heard a sharp report like a rivet head shearing, then another popping noise. The bridge shook beneath his feet. Dust rose through the vibrating flooring. Rust started running toward the west bank, but found himself running uphill as the eastern side dropped first. Then he was engulfed in water. Private John Morgado, standing at the western edge, watched in horror as the bridge came apart. When it came down, he said, the noise and the sight of falling soldiers was terrifying. Men and equipment tumbled into the river. Steel beams twisted and fell. He looked down to see men, several of whom he knew, trying to keep their heads above water. Because they wore heavy gear and the river was flowing so swiftly, they could not stay afloat. Some managed to grab floating debris. Others simply vanished beneath the cold grey water. 28 American engineers were killed. Some died instantly in the collapse, crushed by falling steel. Others drowned in the swift current, weighted down by heavy equipment and unable to reach the surface. 63 more were injured. 18 of the dead were listed as missing, presumably swept away by the Rhine. Their bodies never recovered. The 276th lost its executive officer, 2 company commanders, 3 platoon leaders, and 6 platoon sergeants in a single terrible moment. The investigation identified multiple contributing causes, but no single trigger. The primary cause was determined to be the break in the bottom cord of the upstream truss from the German demolition charge of March 7th. This had forced the downstream truss to carry the entire load and subjected the bridge to destructive twisting forces it was never designed to withstand. Cumulative damage from months of bombing before the capture, direct artillery hits during the 10 days of fighting, V-2 impacts nearby, the added weight of timber decking laid for vehicle traffic, continuous heavy traffic between March 7 and 12, and vibrations from repair work all contributed to the collapse. The bridge, designed to carry railroad traffic for decades, had endured 10 days of punishment no engineer could have anticipated. By then, the Treadway, Pontoon, and Bailey bridges were fully operational. The collapse was a tragedy for the engineers who died, but it did not interrupt the flow of forces across the Rhine. The 9th Armoured Division posted a sign at the ruins that read, "Cross the Rhine with dry feet, courtesy of the 9th Armoured Division." The strategic impact of the Ludendorff Bridge's capture radiated outward in concentric circles of consequence. It gave the Allies a bridgehead across the Rhine 2 full weeks before Montgomery's meticulously planned Operation Plunder. Eisenhower was forced to alter his entire strategy for the final campaign in ways that no one had anticipated. Rather than relying solely on the northern crossing, he reinforced the unexpected central bridgehead, creating a multi-axis advance that the Germans could not contain with their depleted forces. 5 American divisions rapidly pushed into the Ruhr industrial heartland, the factories and mines that had powered the German war machine. The Americans broke out of the bridgehead on March 25, and within days were making 30-mile daily advances toward the Elbe River and the meeting with Soviet forces coming from the east. Eisenhower wrote that Third Corps encountered one of those bright opportunities of war which, when quickly and firmly grasped, produce incalculable effects on future operations. He called the bridge worth its weight in gold, and later reflected that they were across the Rhine on a permanent bridge. The traditional defensive barrier to the heart of Germany was pierced. The final defeat of the enemy was suddenly in their minds just around the corner. German assessments were equally stark. Hermann Göring stated flatly that the capture of the bridge made a long defense impossible. Major General Karl Wagner, Model's chief of staff, said the Remagen affair caused a great stir in German Supreme Command. He believed Remagen should have been considered a basis for termination of the war. Kesselring called it a catastrophe that broke the front along the Rhine. Military historians generally assess that the capture shortened the war in Europe by several weeks to possibly months, saving countless lives on all sides. Karl Timmermann, the German-born American who led the first crossing, received the Distinguished Service Cross on April 5, 1945, from Major General Leonard in a brief ceremony. On furlough in Paris, he read a Stars and Stripes article about his exploit and simultaneously learned he was the father of a baby girl, Gay Diane, born February 28, a daughter he had never seen. He was discharged in December 1945 and returned to Nebraska, but civilian life did not suit him. He re-enlisted and served in the Korean War with the 7th Infantry Division. He participated in the Incheon invasion but was diagnosed with a malignant tumor. He died on October 21, 1951, at Fitzsimmons Army Hospital in Denver. He was only 29 years old. A memorial bridge over the Elkhorn River in West Point, Nebraska, bears his name today. Alexander Drabik returned to Toledo, Ohio, and resumed his career as a butcher. The city honored him with a parade. For decades, Representative Marcy Kaptur sponsored legislation to award him the Medal of Honor for his courage at Remagen. On September 28, 1993, at age 82, Drabik was killed in a car accident on Interstate 70 near Columbia, Missouri. He was driving to a reunion of his Army unit when his car left the road. An Ohio historical marker stands in Holland, Ohio, in his memory. William Hoge rose to Lieutenant General, commanded 9th Corps in Korea during that war, served as Commander-in-Chief of United States Army Europe, and retired in 1955 after a distinguished career. He died in 1979 and is buried at Arlington National Cemetery. Hugh Mott, the engineer who shot the demolition cable with his carbine, rose to Major General and became Adjutant General of the state of Tennessee. Today, the twin stone towers on Remagen's West Bank House, the Peace Museum Bridge at Remagen, established in 1980. The eastern towers stand abandoned, slowly crumbling. The river piers were removed in 1976 as navigation hazards and sold as paperweights to fund the museum. A plaque placed in 2005 reads that "Peace without freedom is not peace," words from Konrad Adenauer, donated by a man who had been a 16-year-old German Air Force helper at the bridge in March 1945. The capture of the Ludendorff Bridge was not the result of grand strategy, but of cascading contingencies. A German general was captured the day before. A major arrived without reinforcements or a working radio. Demolition charges were weakened by Hitler's own paranoid orders from months earlier. An electrical circuit was severed by shellfire. Industrial explosive was substituted for military-grade material. On the American side, it required a chain of officers willing to risk court-martial for seizing an opportunity that contradicted their written orders. The bridge at Remagen reminds us that wars are decided not only by plans, but by the moments when plans fail, and by the individuals on both sides caught in those moments. 4 German officers were executed for failures largely beyond their control. 28 American engineers died when the bridge they were trying to save collapsed beneath them. A 22-year-old lieutenant born in Frankfurt crossed the Rhine into his native land and was dead of cancer 6 years later. The bridge itself survived only 10 days. But those 10 days changed everything. They cracked open the final defense of Nazi Germany. They poured 125,000 American troops onto German soil. They shortened a war that had already claimed tens of millions of lives. The Ludendorff Bridge refused to fall when the Germans needed it to fall. And because it refused, the war ended sooner, and countless soldiers on both sides went home to their families who might otherwise have died in the weeks of fighting that never had to happen. That is the true legacy of the bridge at Remagen.